Hello and welcome. I am Elaine Canyon, sweetly writing happily ever after, one book at a time. And in this video, we're going to talk about the genre of fantasy romance. It's February, and this video is actually going live on February 1st, and it's doing that for a reason. Historians have been able to trace the tradition of sending love letters in February back to the 500s, but in today's day and age, February has been claimed by the romance community. So in honor of the romance community, I decided to create this video in order to talk a little bit about fantasy romance specifically, because that's the genre I write in, and then also to highlight something that I absolutely love, both as a fantasy romance reader and a fantasy romance author. And that is Fantasy Romance February, or farofeb.com. It's a website that is run entirely by fans of the genre of fantasy romance. Their big push is to just make the genre something that people know about. Their whole website is dedicated to explaining the genre, the trends that are coming through, what they're noticing as the genre grows, and they're trying to gain readership for this genre so that authors keep writing it and we can keep reading it and enjoying it and loving it. I've linked it down below in the description, the website. They're also on social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, and so you can follow them on those too. So I highly suggest you go down, if you're a fantasy romance reader, into the description, click the link to the website, go check them out, sign up for their newsletter, find them on your favorite social media platform, and just really dig in. They have a whole set of things planned for this month that are fantasy romance specific. They've got panels that they're going to be doing that you can watch. It's going to be a lot of fun. I hope you enjoy it as much as I enjoy it. Now, it's all well and good if you know what the fantasy romance genre is, but if you don't know what it is, let's talk a little bit about that. Let's start with defining genre. Keep in mind, genre is a communication tool. It's also a marketing tool. We use it to be able to tell other people what we're talking about when we're trying to describe what's in our book and let the reader know what they can expect. Because you definitely don't want somebody who only reads literary fiction to pick up your steampunk novel or your fantasy novel or your sci-fi novel, because those forms of genre fiction often don't have a lot of crossover into literary fiction. That doesn't mean they don't. There's always exceptions. But you don't want to bring somebody into your readership who's the wrong reader and end up giving them a bad experience. If they have a bad experience because they didn't know what to expect, they're not going to talk kindly about you or your book because they were disappointed and they didn't enjoy the experience you gave them. So genre, when we're talking about romance, has some specific expectations. Has expectations like the happily ever after or the happily for now. Readers also expect that the story is going to focus on two people coming together and falling in love over the course of the book. And that is what they expect to see, because at the end you want that happily ever after or the happily for now, and you only get that really if you believe that the characters actually were falling in love as they went through the story. If you are aware of who John Truby is, he's a world-renowned screenwriter, author, and he recently came out with a book called The Art of Genre. It's a really good book. If you haven't read it, I highly suggest it. It's a really interesting deep dive into why we love genres and what some of those genre expectations are. If you're a discovery writer, that's a huge help as far as boundaries go. If you remember, we talked about boundaries in one of our discovery writing videos. Go back and watch that if you're a discovery writer after you finish this one. But the reason I bring it up is because he refers to what each genre is trying to teach us, and the genre lesson, if you will, that he gives for romance is the art of happiness. And I love that because that is the whole point. That's the reason we go to genre fiction, is because we want a specific experience. And if you're reading romance, you're going because you want to be happy. You want to end that book feeling all of the warm, fuzzy feels that just make you smile and feel like the world has good in it and that it's going to be okay and that people fall in love and everything's going to be amazing and wonderful. And so I love that he calls it the art of happiness, because that really resonated with me. So now the other side of fantasy romance is that fantasy side. And fantasy has its own genre expectations. One of those expectations is there's going to be magic or other impossible elements into your story, something that's going to be driving you forward that isn't part of this world. And that storyline will focus on either a single person or a group of people overcoming some sort of evil or massive roadblock that's either a problem in their life or a problem in the world that they live in. It jeopardizes what they hold dear, and that they are the ones responsible for going out and fixing that problem. John Truby in his book calls fantasy the art of living. And I love that. He talks about it in his chapter that fantasy is our vision for a utopia, that we want to believe that perfect worlds exist and that we can make that perfect world exist, that we can create a world where we're happy. And even though things might go wrong, that we have the power to fix those things, and that power lies within us, just like a lot of those magical elements that are in fantasy usually lie within the main character, in either they're the only one who can wield the magic, or them wielding the magic is going to make the difference, or them finding the magical artifact is going to make everything better, those sorts of things. And so when you take John Truby's side of things, that we have the art of living and the art of happiness, I don't know what two genres fit together better than those two. To be able to take living and happiness and bring them together and create stories that tell you you can be happy and that you can create a world for that happiness to exist in. So now that we know some of that deeper side of both romance and fantasy separately, let's bring them together. So a fantasy romance story is a story that's going to include a lot of magical elements, but it's going to have a story that focuses on two people growing together and falling in love until you get to the end, where they either have a happily for now or a happily ever after. Something that fantasy romance pulls from that fantasy side is that happily ever after can happen at the end of a series. And the end of each book doesn't need to have a happily for now unless the author wants it to. So you absolutely can read a series of fantasy romance books and you're not going to get that happily ever after until the end. I don't write that way, but we'll get to that in a little bit. If you go to the Fantasy Romance February website that I mentioned at the beginning of the video, they have this subgenre broken down into smaller subgenres. And the two places that they start with that is either epic fantasy or low fantasy. Epic fantasy includes your things like swords and sorcery, usually otherworld. It can have low magic, it can have high complex magic, it can have paranormal, it can be an alternate history, gas lamps, steampunk. It can even be contemporary in today's day and age. The main thing with the epic is just that we're going to be including all of those other fantasy characters that you've come to expect from things like Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter and David Eddings, when we find those other creatures who aren't actually human but interact in a human world. And then you have the low fantasy side. That can also include your paranormal and your historical and urban. So these books tend to be shorter than the epic fantasy books. And then you can always obviously have a mix of both. One more note is that when we're talking romance in any of its subgenres, we're also talking heat levels. I write sweet romance. And what that means is that I'm not putting sexual content in my books. Whenever we talk about romance and all of its subgenres, there's always a heat level that we talk about too. And what that means is how much sexual content is in the book. That's usually what it focuses on. It can also include swearing and dark themes and things like that, but for the most part, it's the sexual content of what's in it and what's not. I write in sweet. Sweet means that there is no sexual content in the book whatsoever. And then it can move up from there. There can be what some people call spicy, which usually means that there's one depicted sexual scene in the book, and then there's steaming and hot, and it kind of varies. Your mileage will vary depending on who you're talking to. But the thing that most everybody has been able to agree upon is that the word sweet or clean means that you can pick up the book and guarantee that there will be no depicted sexual content. And then it moves up from there. In the trilogy I'm writing right now, it's sweet fantasy romance. There's no sexual content. But I also write differently than a lot of fantasy romance writers do, in that each of my books ends happily ever after. I write my fantasy romance books the way a lot of contemporary romance authors write their series. The trilogy I'm working on right now, each book ends happily ever after and follows a couple as they all work together to take down an evil king. They do this in different ways, and all of them working together is ultimately what brings the king down. But you get to watch each couple work separately and fall in love through the process. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about fantasy romance and what that subgenre entails. I hope you'll go check out the Fantasy Romance February website and their social media and participate in all of the fun things that they have planned. I'd love to hear what your favorite fantasy romance book is down below in the comments. If you haven't hit the subscribe button, I hope you will. I post videos on Wednesdays about discovery writing, graphic and cover design, self-publishing on a teeny tiny budget, and little things like this. I hope I'll see you again soon.